Okay. I was hinting at this last time, but one of the things the sort of unifies last week and this week is colonialism, imperialism. In fact, it's going to link us to our reading for Gandhi, our reading of Gandhi after spring break. We're talking about the expansion of certain powers out in the wider world. A new sort of expansion. One that is not focused necessarily in the areas of the earlier, you might say, sort of burst or explosion of imperialism in the 1600s. That is, it's outside the Americas. There will be some in the Indian Ocean, but by and large, we're going to be looking at expansion in Africa of imperial power and in Southeast Asia. The question being, how do you, by 1900, to get to something like this? This is a map of the British Empire in 1900. All the parts colored in red. British school children would be instructed in this map to say that basically we own all the pink parts. In maps produced at the turn of the century, the empire is usually colored in as pink. The phrase was that Britain owned so much territory around the world that the sun never set on the British Empire. To which the Irish always replied, that's because God doesn't trust them in the dark. But that's a different story for another class. The thing I want to talk about today is some of the rationales for imperialism and some of the means. Not just sort of the reasons why people pursued this, but what enabled them to do so. The technologies in particular that enabled for the vast expansion of European power in a relatively short period, from about 1870 to 1900, in Africa in particular. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk next time about a couple of different specific examples of colonialism and how they fit into this larger sort of template of imperial expansion and the rationales behind imperial expansion. The first thing is this. You just need to set the scene a little bit for the late 19th century, the late 1800s. As we've talked about last time, this is a moment in which international rivalries, international tensions are actually on the rise. You have the emergence of two new and dynamic powers in the world. You have the United States and you have Japan. The United States off asserting itself in the Philippines, building the Panama Canal, the Japanese engaging in warfare in China, ultimately defeating the Russians in the early 20th century, building up a massive industrial presence and commercial presence in South and Southeast Asia. Traditionally places where, for example, British manufacturers had basically had a protected market. This rivalry, this international rivalry, is exacerbated or sharpened by the fact that from the 1870s onward, in much of the world, both you might say sort of the industrialized and the non-industrialized world, you have a dramatic economic slowdown. You have long periods in which industrial economies are in real recession. Some historians consider this actually the first Great Depression of the modern economic history. The big cause of this is not necessarily an overproduction of industrial goods. It's not that industrialization has been too rapid, but rather that the production of primary products, production of agricultural goods in particular around the world, has increased so fast as to absolutely destroy the price of such goods in the global market. Basically commodities, especially agricultural commodities. Grains, beef, dairy products, all of these sorts of things are now being grown, cultivated, raised throughout the globe. You have enormous wheat and cattle operations, for example, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Australia and New Zealand, in Canada and the United States. And not only do you have enormous amounts of land being put into cultivation or being put into livestock grazing, but you also have rapid expansion of railways. You have the coming of the steamship, which is not only allowing for goods to be sort of transported quickly, but refrigerated steamships by the 1880s allow, for example, Argentine beef producers to ship their products throughout the Atlantic, really throughout the world. What you have, if you think, for example, of the railways, the American railways, like the Union Pacific, the Canadian Pacific Railway, the fact that in the late 19th century, Argentina is building a massive railway. Again, all to export these primary goods. What it means is that by the middle of the 1870s, the price of primary products in the world market basically collapses. And this has a knock-on effect for the industrialized world. Sorry?
How does it spark a depression with all these people doing industrial?
Well, what happens is this. The industrialized world, one big example is this. You have Argentina. Argentina makes a great deal of its money by exporting primary products, by exporting beef, by exporting wheat. When the prices of those collapse, it means that the Argentine economy contracts rather dramatically. It means that Argentinians no longer serve as a market for industrial goods. What you have is you have a shrinking of markets because people can no longer afford to buy industrial goods. And we're not just talking about sort of individual consumers. For example, in Argentina, the government, dependent on a lot of customs and tax revenue from its agricultural producers, can't continue to modernize its railway system. They're not collecting enough money. The prices of agricultural goods have collapsed so much. They can't invest in new streetcars for Buenos Aires, for example, which has a huge impact because they're buying, the Argentines buy a lot of their railway material, for example, from Britain. They've employed Scottish firms to come and just design and build a massive nationwide railway system. So you have this, what happens is that you have this collapse in primary prices, and those countries that depend on primary goods can no longer buy industrial goods. Yes, Sean?
Is the population keeping up with the growth, or is the growth outgrowing the population?
Where? In agricultural?
In all of it, yeah. I mean,
oh yeah, no, but the growth of agricultural productivity is far outstripping population at this point. At least in the places where a lot of these goods were going to be sold. That is, in Europe, in the United States, you don't have a huge spike in population in the late 19th century. Instead, population is actually contracting, especially in Europe. Not contracting, let me put it, stabilizing. The rate of the birth rate is no longer increasing in the way it was, which is tied to all sorts of factors. But you have a situation where the collapse of the agricultural market brings about a dramatic slowdown in the industrial world. And this has several effects. Factories start to close, or at least start to close part-time. Hours are reduced. Manufacturers start to try to restrict wages, to decrease wages, or to increase hours in an attempt to sort of increase productivity without having to necessarily increase pay. The result in Europe and to some extent in the United States is the growth of trade unions. If people hadn't been talking a lot about Marx in the 1850s and 1860s, they are in the 1880s. The idea that the factory system or that the industrial system as currently constituted is no longer tenable. So you have large-scale unemployment, large-scale union organization in places like Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, as well as to some degree in the United States. So you have this one impact. You have an economic slowdown. And this economic slowdown affects international rivalries. One of the things that you start to get in the late 19th century is the construction of tariff barriers and of what we might call protectionist schemes to protect domestic agriculture, to keep prices artificially high or higher than they would be in a free market. So you have this sort of idea that now these states are locked in competition. You have this idea that both militarily and economically, as well as politically. You've got new players in the scene like the United States and Japan, and you've got a situation in which these international rivalries are being, as I mentioned, sort of sharpened by economic bad times. I should add one more thing in there. We're talking about new players. There's one who's sort of a new player, but one whose emergence in the 1870s is hugely important. That is a unified Germany. What had been a collection of German-speaking states is, by 1871, welded into one German state. It's largely the work of the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who goes about provoking wars, first with the Danes, then with the Austrians, and then ultimately with the French, in order to consolidate German-speaking territory in Central Europe and create this new unified German state, which styles itself the German Empire after 1871. It's basically a greater Prussia. The Prussians, Bismarck himself was a Prussian, the Prussians run it. Prussian military becomes basically the German military. The Prussian king becomes the German emperor, the Kaiser, K-A-I-S-E-R, which is German for Caesar or emperor. And as we'll talk about a little bit later in the class, in the run-up to the First World War, the emergence of this very powerful German state does cause the French, the Russians, even the British some concern by the end of the 19th century. But you have these new states seeking to assert themselves, and seeking to assert themselves at a time in which their economies are suffering reverses. In this moment, arguments for colonization start to emerge. Along the same lines, we've already seen them in the case of the American drive to take over the Philippines, for example. That is, there are people who will argue that colonies make sense strategically, militarily. At a time in which you've got these new powers emerging, you have to make sure that you can preserve your global influence. You need naval bases. You need control of strategic points on the map. One of the things the Germans will be doing in the late 19th, by the end of the 19th century, is building their own massive navy. Something that annoys the British to no end. But you have this idea that colonization, the control of strategic points, like, for example, canals. We talked about the Panama Canal, the American case. We'll be talking about the British and the Suez Canal in Egypt on Thursday as one example of this sort of, you might say, strategic colonization or strategic imperialism. That is, taking territory because it improves your position sort of in regards to other states around the world. This strategic colonialism does not only apply to taking territory to use it for sort of military purposes, but it also has another aspect to it, one that's championed very much by Bismarck. Bismarck and the Germans do get involved in trying to sort of take territory in Africa, in the South Pacific, even places like Samoa, in the late 19th century. For Bismarck, this is strategic colonization, but it's done with a very specific intent. He once famously said that my map of Africa is drawn in Europe. My map of Africa is drawn in Europe. By which he meant he was only interested in colonization insofar as it helped the German position within Europe. In particular, insofar as it distracted other European powers from thinking about, or kept them from thinking about, this massive new German state in their midst. Sure. He basically said that my map of Africa is drawn in Europe. That is, Germany will get involved in places like Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, not necessarily because they will view these as, worthwhile military outposts or even places that have great economic advantages to them, but because they will be next to, up against colonies held by the British, or by the French in particular. For Bismarck, the idea is keep your European rivals, especially the French, worried about protecting their own imperial territory, their own colonial territory. This is especially true in the case of the French. The French are humiliated by the Germans in 1870, 1871. In order to regain their international prestige, the French look outwards. In the 1880s and the 1890s, the French take over huge chunks of North Africa and West Africa. Places like Senegal, places like Tunisia and Morocco. They've already been in Algeria for quite a while. For the Germans and for Bismarck, colonization is about, in essence, annoying the French and making them spend money elsewhere. Keeping the French distracted from trying to sort of organize some sort of bloc of allies against the Germans back in Europe. The sort of epitome of this German-style colonization for strategic purposes comes around the turn of the century after Bismarck is gone. But as the Germans are building up a larger and larger navy, especially right up here in the Baltic Sea right there, the Germans actually have their eyes. There's a small little island right there called Heligoland. There's absolutely no reason to remember this except for this one. I once was teaching this class and I had a student say, "Oh yeah, my grandfather's from Heligoland," and I almost fell over because I'd never actually known anyone who had any sort of connection to the place. It's very tiny. It's this sort of small island that was under British control. And the Germans wanted it because they wanted to establish a naval base there to help protect the approaches to the Baltic, where they're building up their own fleet. The Germans basically traded with the British at the turn of the century. They traded the island of Zanzibar, which was part of the German colony in Tanzania. They traded Zanzibar for Heligoland. The British wanted to get control of this island, gave them sort of a strategic spot off the east coast of Africa. The Germans wanted Heligoland. This is the sort of dynamic, or the sort of approach, pardon me, thank you, that Bismarck had placed at the heart of German colonial policy. Don't do it for any other reason than that it will improve your position in Europe. By making the French spend money, by giving you, in some senses, these sort of trading pieces. And this is how Europeans view Africa and Africans. Things are just going to be traded, swapped around. Things can be taken for their own advantage. You know, there are people living in Zanzibar. One day they're under German control, the next day they're under British control. It's all decided at meetings far, far away. So you have this idea that colonialism can be strategic. You occupy key points. You can protect your own commerce. You control canals. You can regulate other commerce. You can ensure that your own ships, your own material, your own military equipment can be moved as quickly as possible. But you also have this other thing, the French getting into colonization because they want to sort of reassert themselves internationally. Bismarck and the Germans getting into colonization because it gives them a way, at least in Bismarck's mind, to sort of play the political game in Europe, or the geopolitical game within Europe. So that's one rationale for colonization. The other rationale for colonization, and these are what people talk about in private, by the way. We'll talk about public justification of colonization in a few minutes. But the rationale, the other rationale, is not strategic in terms of sort of military or geopolitical reasons for colonization, but rather what you might call sort of economic colonization. The taking colonies, here's where the logic or the illogic comes in. The taking colonies will do two things. It will give you access to raw materials, access that you can deny to others, access to raw materials that you can gain very cheaply. In the late 19th century, you're seeing what some historians call a second Industrial Revolution, or the second wave of the Industrial Revolution. If the first wave was about iron and steel and textiles, the second wave is about electrical goods, chemicals, and ultimately, by the turn of the century, automobiles. All of these new industries require, and this is, for example, chemicals that will then be used, for example, dyeing fabrics. Electrical goods, from sort of, major pieces of machinery to household electrical consumer goods. All of these demand certain natural resources, most of which are not found in Europe or located close to the industrial centers in the United States. You need copper, obviously, for wire. You need rubber for insulation, for tires. Before you get to the automobile craze in the early 20th century, you have the bicycle craze. I'm not exaggerating, but in the late 19th, early 20th century, bicycle purchases take off dramatically. So you need access to rubber. You need access to other minerals. You need access to things like magnesium. You have this idea that you can basically corner the market on these materials. And what this will do is it will give your state an economic advantage. That at a time of economic stress, you need to find and take every advantage you can. So you will see, for example, British colonization. The British are especially sort of keen on this. British colonization in places like Malaysia and in Burma for rubber. Ultimately in Burma for oil as well. You'll see colonization in South Africa and South Central Africa, where you have resources like gold and diamonds and copper. It's this sort of economic colonization and control of resources that seems very attractive to people. But there's another reason too. This is where sort of you can see people arguing sort of how colonies will help in multiple ways. Some argue that you can create places that are both providers of natural resources and simultaneously serve as markets, for example, for British-made goods. That is, a place can supply raw materials, cheap raw materials, and also serve as a potential sort of market opportunity for British manufacturers.
Creates markets in what?
Well, this is the thing. The idea is that this is going to be both a market and a place that produces raw materials very cheaply. What's the problem there? Can you have both?
Where you make the product and...
No, we make the product, but a place of, can you have a place where you're going to get raw materials cheaply, but also sell manufactured goods? Textiles, for example. Cotton. How do you get raw materials cheaply? You take them.
You pay your workers little.
You pay your workers very little. Sorry?
Go ahead.
You pay your workers very little. What's the problem?
They can't afford it.
They can't afford to buy any of these consumer goods. That's the thing. That these arguments are made sort of simultaneously. The colonies are great because they'll provide us with raw materials and they'll give us basically captive markets. The problem is, a lot of these places, in order to get the raw materials cheaply, you can't afford to pay people that much. And so you have, in many cases, in places like in Africa in particular, one prime example being what's now the Central African state of Zambia, you have colonies that basically become new-style plantations. You have, whether it's in South and South Central Africa, whether it's in places like Malaysia or Burma, especially Malaysia with its rubber plantations, there you have actual, people call them plantations. you have places designed to create sort of low-wage labor, to foster low-wage labor, in order to produce things like, for example, in Zambia, like copper. The northern part of Zambia, where Zambia's northern border borders what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. We'll talk much more about Congo specifically on Thursday. That area is sometimes called the Copper Belt, or the Zambian Copper Belt. Huge deposits of copper. One of the largest sort of concentrations of it anywhere in the world. Central Africa is home to the largest concentrations of some of the most precious and most valuable raw materials on Earth, which has been, in some senses, a little bit of a blessing and an enormous curse because of what's happened because of it. But in places like Zambia, you have a very specific sort of administration set up. That is, the British colony in Zambia has now control of this copper. It needs to make sure it can get cheap labor to extract the copper. What they do is they create a system, basically a state system of coerced labor. They get people to go work for fairly low wages in the copper mines. And they do it not by literally enslaving them, but by creating these sort of mechanisms. What they create is a tax system. Sometimes it was called the hut tax. The hut tax, sort of a crude idea that you would sort of tax people's dwellings. What it's designed to do is it's designed to take people living in Zambia, which at that point was called Northern Rhodesia, to take people living in Zambia and basically say, if you don't pay your taxes, you'll be turned out of your dwelling. You'll be, expelled from your village. You'll be rendered homeless. But the taxes were set at such a point that the average sort of, villager, subsistence farmer could not pay them based simply on what the family economy produced. To which the British and others then said, well, fortunately for you, there is a new economic opportunity up in the Copper Belt. If you want to retain your dwelling, you want to retain your position in the village, you're going to need to go work there. And so what you get is actually a massive migration, especially of Zambian men, out of villages, not, you might say, exactly voluntarily, but because they will not be able to retain anything they own, any land they own, any sort of property they own, unless they can pay their taxes. And the only way they can pay their taxes is by taking on this extra work. So they'll be paid enough so that they can pay their taxes, but they won't be paid much more than that. Sean?
Basically, an evolution of slavery and indentured slavery.
Yeah, it is sort of an indentured servitude, basically. That these guys are paid very little, all sorts of advantages taken of them, and that there's really no settlement up in the Copper Belt. These sort of company towns are created. The British colonial government basically contracts with private enterprise to run these coal mines. Basically the British government says to these companies is you come in and do the mining, these British companies, it gives us access to this raw material, we will ensure that you get cheap labor. And they ensure that they get cheap labor by creating this tax system that makes it impossible for people to sort of avoid taking this opportunity.
Are they paying them in company made money? I mean, I know like we had in America where
you scrip or something? No, yeah. They're paying them in cash because they have to actually pay the taxes. But it sort of worked out. It's sort of a system worked out whereby any money that they don't pay in taxes gets sort of gobbled up by the companies themselves. I mean, basically, all the British government does is says we will ensure that there'll be a supply of cheap labor by instituting this tax system. What you do with that labor is up to you. And so you have this massive sort of migration within South Central Africa towards not just Zambian copper mines, but in South Africa to gold and diamond mines. Gold, valuable for its insulating properties, valuable for obviously sort of consumer use, valuable obviously as a sort of the basis for currency. Diamonds, perhaps even more important, because diamonds, this is before the sort of consumer craze for diamonds, but diamonds are hugely important in industrial production. Diamond-tipped saws, things like that, for cutting all sorts of materials. So you have this situation where ultimately the decision is made, you might say, that these will not be markets for goods, they will instead be basically plantation-style economies that produce low, or that extract resources at low cost to colonial states. And this is one of the reasons that historians identify as, sort of leading to and ultimately sort of almost imprisoning African societies. Because these are basically resourced extraction or extraction-based economies. That's the only way they earn money. The problem, well, there's a couple problems. Because they don't function as markets, the colonial governments did not introduce any sort of, you might say, sort of market infrastructure. That is, a place like India, which was seen early on as a market, for example, for British textiles, has an infrastructure. For transport, for commerce. There is, at least to some degree, an indigenous infrastructure. Indians are working in things like warehousing and brokering and insurance and banking. You don't create any of that structure in a place like Zambia, or you create very little of that structure in a place like Zambia. Instead, because you're paying these people such low wages, they're not going to be buying a lot of consumer goods. Instead, you don't create opportunities for people to, sort of work in trade, work in, it might seem sort of strange to think about it, but trade, commerce brings all sorts of ancillary opportunities. You need accountants, you need people to, write ads for you. You need people to create insurance policies, to organize shipping, all of these sorts of things, and you don't get that. Instead, what you have in places like Zambia, ultimately in places like Congo, places like Nigeria, at the middle of the 20th century, when a lot of these places attain their independence from colonial rule, the only way in which they can continue to function economically is to continue to basically export raw materials, which leaves them open to all sorts of corruption, and leaves them open to all sorts of outside influence, because these are places that have the materials, but they don't have any indigenous control over, for example, the means of extracting these materials. In order for the new state of Zambia to make money, they've got to continue to rely on outside technological help, outside transport and shipping help. So you have is basically what some economists would call chronic underdevelopment in these states, even after they reach independence, because they have been designed as basically plantation colonies, where resources will be extracted, but no commercial infrastructure, no sort of market structure actually emerges. And this is one of the reasons why places like Zambia, but perhaps the best case, we'll talk about it next time, was now the Democratic Republic of Congo, a place that contains the most valuable raw materials on Earth. A place that should, by just its resources, be one of the richest places on Earth, is instead in complete political and economic chaos. When you look at what the Congo possesses, it's not just things like copper. They've got gold and diamonds. They've got things like magnesium and zinc.
What's magnesium used for?
Magnesium is used in all sorts of chemicals, in dyes. In particular, it can be used for chemical reactions to produce dyes. Magnesium can be used. It can be used actually as an I think magnesium can be used as an electrical conductor as well, if I remember correctly. Used in all sorts of industrial switches and things like that. Anyone else think? I'm not a
Sparklers.
Sorry, sparklers. Exactly, fireworks. But the Congo also possesses coltan. Anyone know what coltan is? You all are carrying around little pieces of coltan. It's all on your cell phones.
Oh,
Or your laptops too. But it's something that's involved in making microprocessors. So you'd think a place that has, an enormous abundance of that alone. You've also got uranium in Congo, just because why not? Actually, the uranium that goes into making the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in August 1945 is actually from the Congo, from the Belgian colony of the Congo. So talking about sort of a global war, but it's uranium extracted in the Congo, refined in various parts of the United States, and then ultimately dropped on the Japanese.
Does the Congo have rubber too?
It does have rubber. It doesn't nearly have as much rubber as it did 100 years ago, once the Belgians got done with it. But yeah, they had a lot of rubber. Even before that, as we'll talk about on Thursday, they had a lot of ivory. There were a lot of elephants and hippos in the Congo. Not so much anymore, because of mass sort of culling of them in the 1870s and 1880s. That we'll talk about. So much so that basically, they drove, at least within the Congo, these species almost to extinction. Any questions so far?
How is rubber extracted?
Well, there's different ways you can do it. There's basically it's almost sort of like domesticated rubber trees, which you can grow in plantations, like you get, for example, you'll have it in Indonesia, in Malaysia. I think in the Philippines there's a little bit of rubber growing, which is basically it's sort of like it's sort of produced almost like a sap, and you tap trees, and what you do is you basically go and you gather the stuff, and then it hardens up. It has to be sort of warmed and heated, but that's sort of a traditional domesticated way. It's a massive rubber plantation, rows and rows of rubber trees planted. I mean, rubber originally from parts, for example, of Central America that is then transplanted to Asia. The other way is the way that happens in the Congo under the Belgians in the early 20th century is you have basically wild rubber, these vines that are filled with this sort of rubber sap. And what you do is you basically have to go and slice them open and collect as much as you can. It's very hard to regenerate that kind of rubber because, of course, it's sort of growing wild. In the Congo, you don't have the availability of massive amounts of arable land that can be used to create these plantations like you have, for example, in Malaysia. Malaysia also, by the way, I should stress, has a lot of tin. Among other things, you will see the migration. Pardon me. The migration. This will tie into Gandhi too. The migration of lots of people from India in the late 19th century to places like Malaysia and Burma, to South Africa, even to places in the Caribbean like Trinidad and Barbados, to work in various plantations as indentured labor, literal indentured labor. It's also why you have the huge expansion of what comes to be known as the overseas Chinese population in Southeast Asia. There had always been Chinese settlers in the Indian Ocean, people involved in trade and commerce, but especially in the late 19th century, you see the massive movement of Chinese to work in mines, the copper and tin mines in Malaysia in particular. So you have this idea that these are sort of, resource-rich places that can, in essence, sort of, capped at a certain level of development. Where any infrastructure created will entirely be sort of focused on the extraction and the movement of these natural resources, not on anything else. Any questions about this? So this is the reason why. Now, not a lot of people who support empire are willing to simply sort of state quite baldly and directly, well, we're taking this over because we want it. There are some who will argue, there will be people who you might consider to be social Darwinists, who will argue that the relationship between peoples is governed by the same things that Darwin saw between species. They kind of misread Darwin, but they say it's a competition, and the strong must do whatever they need to do to survive. With Darwin, it's more sort of it's basically sort of environment dictating who survives. What kind of food source exists, favors one type of finch in the Galapagos over another, in terms of the size of the beak, for example. what people translate that into is they say, well, human societies are like that. They're in competition for resources. The strong are basically justified in doing what's ever needed to survive. It's almost as though, Darwin had come back and said, well, some finches saw that they needed to, access food more readily than other finches, so they extended their beaks. They all went in for beakotomies or something like that. They got new beaks attached. Instead, it's environment. It's historical accident, you might say. It's genetic accident that allows some species to continue and others to die off. That's translated, human beings don't want to hear about historical accidents. We want to talk about driving our own destiny or something like that. So instead, the idea is that this is what nation states must do. If I can take you over, if I can take over your country, if I can take your resources, it means I'm strong and you're weak. And the weak have absolutely no sort of legitimate response. The strong must do what they need to do to survive. Now, sorry, Kelly.
So is that how it ties into like Marx and Engels? Is the people that own the production are like in Africa or like not like people that are working for it are not benefiting from it?
Well, they would say, my Marx and Engels wouldn't apply it necessarily because they say this is really sort of an industrial world. It's sort of interesting in that you do create this sort of proletariat, but it's a very specific type of proletariat, one that's entirely sort of in indentured servitude, and one that doesn't have access to sort of the institutions that Marx, for example, saw as necessary for allowing for political transformation. That is, Marx and Engels saw it, and the person who will ultimately come to critique colonialism is not Marx or Engels, but it's Lenin. And Lenin will basically say that imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. What he'll say, and he'll say that basically, European states have run out of ways to invest in themselves, and they need to go take other territory to soak up all this excess money, which is not necessarily the case. It's certainly indicative of an approach within late 19th century capitalism, but it's more so about sort of exploiting resources and exploiting labor than it is about sort of excess capital looking for a place to find itself. Yeah, Sean.
What big role do the industries and the governments play in Congo keeping the instability? It's been going on now. It still seems instability.
Well, you mean today? Well, we'll talk about this more on Thursday. But one of the things is that there has been, a great deal of outside interference in a place like Congo because, in the Cold War, for example, the question was, who's going to have influence in the Congo? Who's going to have access to resources? And so, in the early 1960s, you have the CIA actively involved in deposing an elected leader in Congo and his replacement by an army colonel. More in the sense of, getting, our guy in charge rather than, somebody who seemed to be potentially, a little bit left-leaning. A lot of these places get caught up in the Cold War as well. You have these huge and vicious proxy wars. Even a place like Angola, with the Americans funding one side of the Angolan Civil War, and for crying out loud, in the 1970s, you have Cubans fighting in Angola. It was just sort of strange sort of mixes of people. But it's because these are seen as sort of pawns within larger political / economic rivalries. So you have this, as I said, this idea, which is at times promoted, sort of, almost sort of nakedly, as the strong must do what they need to survive. But that's not perhaps the most popular argument for empire. Simply asserting that might makes right. So there's a lot of other arguments made about empire in the late 19th century. Arguments made to justify it. The most particular of these is an argument that is based a little bit on sort of this social Darwinist idea, that there are strong and weak. But it's not based on the idea that the strong can simply take what they want from the weak. Rather, it's based on the idea that it is incumbent upon the strong to help the weak by taking them over. It is that empire is not something done because of economic gain or military gain. That empire is a giant philanthropic enterprise that it's entirely altruistic, that it's not being done for the good of the colonizers, it's being done for the good of the colonized. This gets summed up in phrases like the civilizing mission. The poet Rudyard Kipling at the turn of the century, urging the Americans to stay in the Philippines, will call it the white man's burden. He'll say in this famous poem that you've got to go out among what he calls the lesser breeds. And he says, you're not going to be thanked for it. Don't expect them to be very happy. That is, people out in these, sort of, out in what he considers basically sort of the darker regions of the earth, the less evolved, the less developed. He says, no, you're going to go out there, they're not going to like you for it, but you're going to be doing them a service. In essence, nobody wants to be an imperial power, but we have to be, morally. Oh shoot, look what we have to do. It is incumbent upon us. So you have a lot of these arguments about sort of the morality of imperial rule. Whether it's the Americans in the Philippines, whether it's the British in India or Malaysia, whether it's the French in West Africa or Morocco, the idea is that they are there to bring quote-unquote civilization. Yes, it may actually bring them some economic benefit, but that's just sort of perhaps a reward for their initial sort of noble ideals and sort of going out to help people. So you'll have, and there are people who do believe this. I shouldn't say that this is completely cynical. There are people who do believe this. Christian missionaries, some philanthropists who do actually believe that there is sort of this hierarchy of peoples, and that it is the responsibility of the sort of people higher up the hierarchy to help those lower down. But for many people, this idea of this sort of civilizing and improving mission out in the world is much more sort of a convenient cloak. It's something that I think continues to this day. That is, that people are very unwilling, perhaps, to identify their real interests, because of course they seem so crass. Why do the Russians want the Crimea right now?
It's the most important port.
It's their Black Sea warm water naval port. But no, it's because the Crimeans all want to be with Russia. Look, 97% of them voted to join with the Russians. 99% of Iraqis used to, say Saddam Hussein was the greatest person who'd ever lived. 107% of people say that, whoever the leader, Kim Jong-un in North Korea is. 113%. North Korean math is a very interesting subject. People don't, people will talk about, oh, we're going to go out and make the world safe for democracy. We're going to bring democracy to the people, whether they want it or not. It's used at times very much to cloak, I think, the very real sort of economic and political interests at work. A lot of places are not comfortable, as I talked about last week, a lot of places are not comfortable with empires. They want to have all the benefits, but they don't want to be seen as an empire. This country, Britain, France in particular, are the three who at the turn of the century really do struggle. Because they want to sort of say, the French create this whole sort of notion of what they call la mission civilisatrice, that is the civilizing mission, as we get the phrase, where they're basically saying, we're going out to spread the ideals of France. They pretty soon give up on that. One thing that's never really bothered the Germans as much is the sort of idea of colonization as philanthropic activity. The Germans have always been sort of simply much more content to do things and then say, well, of course we wanted it, so we took it. Bismarck among those, you might say, who belongs to that school. So you have this sort of public rhetoric of empire, and you have the sort of the reality, the much more, you might say, sort of real political and economic stakes at work here. So that's something to keep in mind. There will be created an entire rhetoric, an entire sort of language of imperial benevolence and colonial sort of responsibility, but one that will oftentimes not very much accord with what's going on the ground of these colonies. and we'll talk about in the early 20th century how there is sort of this moment of crisis among colonizers over sort of, you know, the disjunction of the distinction between what they say they're doing and what they're actually up to. Any questions about that? Before I turn to one more thing. So these are the reasons presented for, you know, why go take an empire, why go increase your colonies. The other thing that has to be noted is that you could have all the reasons, all the desires for colonies you want, but you need to be able to take them and secure them. Simply wanting colonies is not enough. You have to have the means. And the late 19th century provides the means in several important ways. Tied very much to sort of the industrial and technological development going on within Europe in the late 19th century, and the way in which those technologies are applied to the actual practice of colonial rule. I mentioned a couple of them already. You have steamships and railways. Allow for much faster movement of people. The use of steamships not only in sort of ocean-going voyages, but for example, the Belgians will use steamships in the Congo River in order to secure their rule, to enforce their rule, to enforce certain trade structures. The writer Joseph Conrad, who wrote Heart of Darkness, about his, you know, basically sort of autobiographical fiction about his own experiences. He was a steamship pilot. That is, he was the captain of one of these steamships that went up and down the Congo. You have railways that once they are built, they enable much easier communication. They enable the movement of troops and materials. By the 1870s, the railway system in India, the British colony of India, is one of the largest in the world. The British government is so determined to sort of weld India together as a market, as sort of a viable united colony, commercially, even sort of militarily, that they give a huge incentive to British companies to come out and build the railways there. Basically, the British government tells these railway companies, come and build the railway and we will guarantee you a certain profit. That's how the British companies then go out and get investors to build to raise the money to then build the railways in India. Is that the British government says it's something like, we'll guarantee you at least 5% sort of profit. And whatever else you can make on it goes too. But the idea is that this is the safest investment in the world. If somebody says, invest this money and I'm going to guarantee you at least a 5% return. If you think that that's somehow going to lose you money, you're insane. It's like somebody saying, here, give me $100. In 6 months I'll give you $105. But on a much larger scale. So if you have the money to invest, then you can do it. And the British are ultimately able to create this enormous railway system. You'll see railways developed in South Africa. The British will dream of linking Cape Town to Cairo by railway. The Germans have their own. Apparently the idea was you had to have alliteration if you wanted to have a railway, because the Germans have their own idea of Berlin to Baghdad. The problem is the Turks in Istanbul was there's no other places than I that they could link to. But Cape to Cairo was the big sort of British dream. So you have this situation where railways can weld together a state or a colony. You have huge advances in weaponry, in military technology. The most important of these is the machine gun. What in the late 19th century will be known as the Maxim gun, after its inventor. A gun that, for its time, can fire, for example, a round a second. One that is a dramatic increase in firepower and one which can be applied in particular in colonial situations where you may have a very small armed force, usually perhaps a few Europeans as officers, some indigenous troops raised from the local population, that are oftentimes faced off against much larger indigenous forces, but ones which are not nearly as well armed. The machine gun is what in military terms you call a force multiplier. Basically, 10 men with rifles is one thing. 10 men with 2 machine guns, 2 Maxim guns, is a much more potent force. And so you have a situation whereby in various parts of the colonial world, small numbers of European or European-led troops can take on and defeat much larger indigenous armies. We'll talk about a particular case of this involving Egypt and Sudan and the British there next time. But this is something that basically numbers start not to matter. Weaponry matters. It's a lesson that for some reason Europeans will apply out in the colonies and completely forget when they come to fight the First World War amongst themselves. Where the idea will be, oh, numbers still matter. Let's all run at this entrenched machine gun position. With pistols and batons if you're a British officer. So you can deflect the bullets with the baton while you fire the pistol. That's the only rationale I have for it. They don't seem to learn that, with the result, of course, that millions are slaughtered in Europe between 1914 and 1918. But you have, in South Africa, in Egypt and Sudan, in other parts of the colonial world, these new weapons used to enormous effect. And there's one other, you might say, sort of scientific breakthrough, perhaps the most important, and that's quinine. Quinine, a compound originally found in trees in South America, in the highlands of places like Bolivia, the cinchona tree, Cinchona, the cinchona tree. Quinine is something, it doesn't, if you get malaria, you've got malaria. You can't get rid of malaria. But quinine protects you against getting malaria. Originally, it's a sort of a naturally found compound, extracted from the bark of the cinchona trees, powdered, diluted into water, made into pills. In the 1850s, a couple of French chemists figure out how to extract this on sort of a massive scale from cinchona bark. You have various European companies who go and literally take trees, saplings, things that have been sort of grafted together from South America and start building or planting cinchona plantations in, for example, Malaysia, where you produce enough of this raw material, you now can produce all this quinine. It's fine to have a steamship that will allow you to sail up the Congo River. It's fine to say you've got a machine gun to take on indigenous people who may not prove as cooperative as you'd like, but none of that is any good if you die of malaria on the way. So quinine is the sort of the final piece of the puzzle, and perhaps the most important part. Because now Europeans can go inland in Africa and stay there. That as long as you have a reliable sort of dose of quinine. Quinine infused into carbonated water, tonic water. By the end of the 19th century, many out in the colonies have realized if you add a little gin to the tonic water, it tastes better. It goes down much more smoothly. Because have you ever drank tonic water with quinine in it just alone? Not without gin. Well, there we are. It's not necessarily a pleasant experience. So instead, I mean, you might say you can sort of self-medicate in multiple ways. Have a gin and tonic, sit on the veranda of your colonial, plantation house somewhere in Zambia or something like that, and protect yourself from malaria. It doesn't cure malaria, but it does act to increase your resistance to it or your protection from it. And it's now made in all sorts of synthetic ways. That is, there are all sorts of quinine derivatives or chemical sort of synthesized versions of quinine. that are available. And if you go to a malarial region, you go to India, or you go to other parts of South Asia, or you go to Africa, you may take it. Sometimes you take it a pill once when you're there, once when you come back. It depends. If you've been in the military, oftentimes they test these sort of things on you. You may not have been aware that they were testing them, but in the first Gulf War, there was a distribution of anti-malarials, which caused some people to have enormously vivid nightmares and created enormous feelings of paranoia. And people decided that, you know what, we shouldn't have people who have access to tanks having these sorts of feelings. So they tried to sort of, work out the dosages and the sort of the way in which these things are synthesized ever since. Is there a question? Yeah.
Is quinine what gives tonic water its taste?
I think so.
Because I think tonic water is actually delicious.
You do?
I do.
Really?
Yeah.
You are in a select group. Yes. I've never been able to drink tonic water by itself, but
I don't like carbonated water, but
Germans
tonic
like-
water is really good.
Germans like it.
Germans love carbonated water.
Well, they like carbonated water. They like tonic water, though?
It tastes like it's water with bubbles.
But not like club soda or something like that.
It tastes like.
I don't even know what club soda is for cleaning rugs, But I've never met anybody who liked tonic water before. But I'm sure there are some people who do. Yes, I mean we all have our different tastes. Yeah, sparkling. I don't know. It's people have different tastes for it. I mean, I think Dr. Pepper is the most vile thing ever created. So but sort of hear people's enamel on their teeth receding as they drink it. But that's just me. So again, tonic water. Is that one of those energy drinks?
No, this will take the enamel.
Yeah, that will. Yeah, that's a step beyond. Really. But yeah, a lot of people did sort of mix things with tonic water though, because they didn't like the taste. And I think it's also been a little bit refined. But even now, you see tonic water, like Canada Dry tonic water, it says with quinine on it. I don't know how much you'd have to drink and then go sort of traipse around, Tanzania for a while and be safe from malaria. It might be quite a lot, but that is interesting. Other questions? So you have this, and what's important is you not just have sort of the reasons behind this desire to go out and take colonies, but you also have the means that enable this to go on. So it's this combination of factors: international rivalry, international economic rivalry at a time of international economic contraction. You have new nation states, Germany, Japan, the United States, all seeking to assert themselves. You have others like France seeking to sort of recover their international reputation after being catastrophically defeated by the Germans in 1870. You have the British seeking to maintain their preeminence as the world's dominant naval power, especially in the face of both American and especially German naval building campaigns and sort of, you might say, almost sort of naval arms races.
What's the Spanish doing?
The Spanish, not much. Spain and Portugal at this time are still, they're not very, one of these are not necessarily industrial societies. These are societies that remain very much sort of agricultural, very hierarchical. In the same way that much of sort of southern Italy, that is, you can sort of trace an arc, sort of the Iberian Peninsula here and southern Italy, where you have traditional sort of very hierarchical social order, lots of people living on the land, large numbers of peasants.
So they're not expanding to Africa and
No,
China.
the Spanish will. The Spanish do actually take. There's a little tiny little piece. I'll get a map of Africa the next time. There's a little tiny piece of land right here. That is the one Spanish colony. Well, Casablanca?
Yeah.
Well, that's in.
You could touch Spain on it.
Yeah, but Casablanca is sort of a French colony. It is a French, but you're right. I mean, it's right across. It's right across the Mediterranean from Spain. Casablanca, I thought was in Morocco. Is it? Okay. But it's that's the. It is this tiny little. There is actually a little tiny Spanish colony right here. It's not very big, but it's sort of squeezed in between the French and on both sides. So you have these various things that combine to force sort of not to force, but to provoke and ultimately to justify imperialism and to facilitate it. We'll talk next time about two cases. We're going to talk about Egypt and we'll talk about the Congo as examples of strategic and, respectively, strategic and economic colonization and how they raise questions about colonization at the same time as they allow for the expansion of European power abroad. All right, I will see you all on Thursday. Thank you.
And this one, it's Danny, more of the French.